Deadwood Creek, Wyoming. Winter 1875. You'll work off that debt, Thaddeus sneered, tapping the contract. No way out. Miss Montgomery. Clara trembled, cornered. Then a voice cut through the smoke. I'll play you for her. A scarred stranger sat down, wagered everything he owned and won. Dragging her into the blizzard, he leaned in close. Your innocence ends tonight, he whispered. What happens next? Stay till the end, and hit like and subscribe. The wind hit Deadwood Creek like a fist. Clara Montgomery stepped off the coach with her carpet bag clutched to her chest and looked for the schoolhouse she'd been promised. She found mud instead. Mud and smoke and men who stared too long. The letter in her pocket had promised a teaching post, $40 a month, a room of her own. She'd read it so many times the creases had gone soft. There was no schoolhouse. There was only a saloon called the Golden Nugget, and a man named Thaddeus Stone waiting behind its bar with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Miss Montgomery, he said, like he'd known her for years. I'm afraid there's been a change of plans. The change of plans took an hour to explain. A travel contract she didn't remember signing. Fees for the coach, the meals, the very letter that had lured her out here. Numbers stacked on numbers until the total swallowed her whole. Thaddeus slid the paper across the bar and tapped it with one manicured finger. You'll work it off, he said. Won't take long. Pretty girl like you. Clara understood then what kind of work he meant. The girls drifting between tables in low-cut dresses. The men watching her the same way they watched them. Her stomach dropped through the floor. I won't, she said. You will. Thaddeus's smile didn't move. There's no train back east till spring, and even if there were, you couldn't pay for the ticket. This is Deadwood Creek, Miss Montgomery. Out here, a debt is a debt. The saloon closed in around her. Cigar smoke hung thick under the lamps. Somewhere a piano limped through a tune nobody was dancing to. A man at the corner table laughed too loud, and Clara flinched. And Thaddeus saw her flinch, and he liked it. That was when the voice came from the shadows near the stairs. I'll play you for it. Every head turned. The man who stepped into the light was tall, weathered, a scar cutting white through one eyebrow. He wore his coat like it had seen worse winters than this one. Thaddeus's smile finally slipped. Vance, he said, this isn't your business. Made it my business. Silas Vance pulled out a chair and sat down across the poker table like he owned it. One hand. Winner takes the girl's contract. Thaddeus laughed. But there was an edge under it now. He'd wanted Silas's land for 2 years. The water rights that ran through it. And everyone in town knew he'd tried 3 different ways to force Silas out. Here was a man handing him a 4th. And if I win, my deed. Silas said it flat. No hesitation. The whole ranch. The room went quiet enough to hear the wind scraping the windows. Clara stood frozen by the bar, watching 2 men decide her life with a deck of cards, and hating that there was nothing else she could do. She had come west to teach children their letters. Instead, she was a chip on a table. The cards went around. Thaddeus dealt slow, savoring it, sure of himself the way men like him always were. Clara watched Silas's face and found nothing there. No fear, no triumph, just a man doing a job. When the hands turned over, Thaddeus's smile died for good. Well, Silas gathered the contract off the table and stood. That settles that. Thaddeus's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. You'll regret this. Vance, been regretting things since '63, Silas said. One more won't kill me. He didn't wait for Clara to agree to anything. He simply held the door, and the blizzard howled through it. And she understood she had a choice between the storm outside and the men inside. And the storm was safer. She followed him into the alley, into snow that stung like needles, her thin coat useless against it. He stopped her there, in the narrow space between the saloon wall and the dark, and turned to face her. Up close, his scar looked older than he did. His eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Clara pressed her back against the cold wood and shivered. And she couldn't have said if it was the cold or the fear or the sheer strangeness of being free and not knowing what free meant anymore. Your innocence ends tonight, Silas said quietly. She trembled. She waited for the rest of it. Whatever cruelty was supposed to follow a line like that. It didn't come. He stepped back and gave her room to breathe. Not like you're thinking, he said. I mean, you came out here believing the world plays fair. It doesn't. Not for people like you. Not for people like me. Best you learn that now, before it costs you more than a bad contract. He turned and started walking toward two horses tied at the rail, snow already collecting on his shoulders. You coming, or you staying? Clara looked back once at the saloon's glowing windows, at the life she'd almost been sold into. Then she looked at the horse standing ready in the storm. She went after him. The ranch sat low against the hills, snow banked high along its fence lines, smoke curling steady from the chimney of the main house. Clara had pictured something else on the ride out. A bunkhouse full of rough men, maybe a barn, where she'd be locked up until Silas Vance decided what to do with his winnings. What she found instead was a kitchen full of people already eating breakfast. She stood in the doorway, with snow still melting off her boots, and counted faces. A black man, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, pouring coffee for a boy who looked to be 12. 2 Lakota men speaking low to each other near the stove. An older woman with a cane propped against her chair, laughing at something. Nobody looked up at Clara like she was strange. They looked up like she was late. Sit, Silas said, pulling out a chair. Eat something. You look half frozen. Clara sat because her legs didn't give her much choice. A plate appeared in front of her, eggs and biscuits, and she stared at it instead of eating, still waiting for the catch. There was always a catch. Thaddeus had taught her that much in one conversation. This is Eli, Silas said, nodding at the man with the coffee pot. Runs the horses better than I do. That's Standing Bear and his brother Two Elk. Out here doing carpentry work, most men in town won't hire them for, Mrs. Ruiz keeps this whole operation from falling apart. Mrs. Ruiz snorted. Somebody's got to. Clara looked around the table again. Slower this time. Nobody was serving anybody. They were just eating together, the way families ate together. And she didn't have a word ready for what that did to her chest. Where's the girl? Clara asked. You mentioned a daughter. Something shifted in Silas's face. Quick and gone. Maya's out back. She doesn't come in for breakfast most days. Why not? She doesn't like crowds. Doesn't talk much either. He said it plain. No apology in it. Like he was stating the weather. You'll meet her when she's ready. After breakfast, Silas walked Clara out to the barn without asking if she wanted to go. She followed anyway, curious despite herself, and found him already at work with a pitchfork, mucking out a stall like it was nothing, like he hadn't just walked out of a poker game the night before holding another human being's contract. You're doing that yourself, she said. Somebody's got to. He didn't stop working. You expected me to have men for this. I expected you to have a lot of things you don't seem to have. He laughed at that, short and surprised, and the sound of it made the barn feel warmer. He kept working while he talked, and she found herself watching his hands more than his face. Blistered palms, a scar across one knuckle. These were not the hands of a man who sat behind a desk counting other people's debts. I bought this land after the war, he said. Nobody else wanted it. Too far from town. Too much rock in the soil. Didn't take me long to figure out why nobody else wanted it either. Half the folks around here won't hire a freedman or a native man for honest wage. Won't rent to a woman on her own. Won't look twice at a child nobody claims. He tossed a forkful of dirty straw into the wheelbarrow. So I started letting people stay. Turned out I needed the help anyway. That simple. Wasn't simple at all. Still isn't. But it works better than most things I've tried. Clara thought about the contract Thaddeus had shoved at her, the neat rows of numbers designed to trap her forever. She thought about the saloon girls who'd watched her with tired, knowing eyes, like they'd seen 100 girls arrive with the same letter in their pocket. What happens to my contract now? She asked. Silas set the pitchfork against the wall and walked to the stove in the corner of the barn, where a small fire kept the worst of the cold out. He reached into his coat and pulled out the paper Thaddeus had handed him at the table. Then he threw it in the fire. Clara watched it curl and blacken. the numbers that had owned her turning to ash in seconds. She felt something crack open in her chest that she'd been holding shut since the coach first pulled into town. "You're free," Silas said. "Nobody here owns you. Not me, not Thaddeus, not anybody. You can ride out tomorrow if you want, though I'd wait till the road's clear. And if I stay, then I've got a job for you, if you want it. Real work, real wage." He nodded toward the house. "Maya needs someone to teach her. Reading, writing, numbers. She hasn't spoken a word since I found her 2 winters back. And every teacher in town has refused her because they say she's simple. She isn't simple. She's scared." Clara looked at the ashes of her contract, still smoking faintly on the barn floor. "I came out here to teach," she said. "Nobody told me it would look like this." "Nothing out here looks like what people tell you," Silas said. "That's the first lesson. The second one is that a man's worth showing you, not telling you. Anybody can say the right words. Watch what they do with their hands." Clara thought about that for a long time after, mucking out stalls beside him, though nobody had asked her to, learning the names of horses she'd never ridden, watching Eli and Standing Bear work the fence line without a single order barked between them. Nobody here talked about equality like it was a speech. They just lived it, plate by plate, chore by chore. And somehow that said more than any sermon she'd ever sat through back east. By afternoon, she found herself in the small room off the kitchen that would be hers, a narrow bed and a window looking out over the hills. And she sat on the edge of it and finally let herself cry, not from fear this time, from something closer to relief, the kind that comes after you've been holding your breath so long you forgot you were doing it. Maya was 7 years old and had eyes too old for her face. Clara found her the next morning sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket too big for her, watching the horizon like she expected something to come out of it. She had light brown skin and dark, curling hair, and a stillness about her that made the whole yard feel quiet. "Good morning," Clara said, sitting down a careful distance away. "I'm Clara. I hear you might let me teach you some letters." Maya didn't answer. She didn't look at Clara either, not right away. But she didn't get up and leave, and Silas had told her that was usually the best sign she'd get. Clara didn't push. She sat with the girl in silence for a long while, watching the same horizon, and eventually pulled a small book from her coat pocket and began reading aloud to nobody in particular. A story about a fox who outsmarted a hunter through patience rather than speed. She read 3 pages before she noticed Maya had turned her head, just slightly, to listen. That became the pattern. Every morning, the porch steps, a book, no demands. Clara stopped expecting words and started paying attention to everything else. The way Maya's hands moved when she liked a part of the story. The way she flinched at loud noises from the barn, at raised voices, at anything sudden. Clara had read about children like this in a journal back east. Children whose minds had built walls to survive something nobody wanted to name out loud. By the second week, Maya was sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. By the third, she picked up a stick and drew letters in the dirt beside Clara's boot. Wobbly, uncertain letters. Her own name. Clara didn't make a show of it. She'd learned enough already to know that a fuss would send the girl running. She just nodded, like it was the most natural thing in the world, and wrote her own name beside it. And Maya studied the 2 words like she was memorizing something sacred. Silas watched all of this from the barn doorway more often than Clara realized. He told himself he was checking on the horses. He wasn't checking on the horses. He'd tried teachers before. 2 women from town who'd come out reluctantly, paid well, and left within a week, complaining that the girl was broken beyond fixing, that nothing could be done for a child who wouldn't even say her own name. He'd almost stopped trying after the second one, almost decided that some wounds just didn't close, and a man had to accept that and move on. Then, this stranger from a poker table showed up with nothing but a carpet bag and sat on his porch steps every morning, asking for nothing in return. He found Clara alone one evening, mending a torn hem by lamplight in the kitchen after Maya had gone to bed. "She said 3 words to Mrs. Ruiz today," he said. "First words in 2 years. Clara looked up. What did she say? Asked for more bread. He said it simply, but his voice had gone rough around the edges. 2 years. And it's bread that finally does it. It's not the bread, Clara said. It's that she trusts the room enough to ask for it. That takes longer than people think. You can't force a child to feel safe. You can only keep showing up until they believe it's true. Silas sat down across from her, the lamp between them throwing long shadows across the table. You're good at this. Better than I expected. I had a good teacher once, Clara said. My father. He used to say patience was the only thing that ever actually changed a mind. Everything else was just noise. He sounds like a smart man. Clara's hands stilled on the mending. Somebody shot him for it, back in Boston. He spent his life fighting for people the law wouldn't protect. And one night, a man decided that made him a threat worth killing. Silas didn't offer empty comfort. He didn't tell her it would be all right, or that her father's death had meant something grand and noble that made the loss easier to carry. He just sat with the weight of what she'd said, letting it exist in the room without trying to shrink it. That why you came west? He asked finally. I came west because a letter promised me a schoolhouse and $40 a month, Clara said, and the corner of her mouth pulled up despite everything. Turns out, the letter was a lie built by a man who profits off girls like me. But I suppose some part of me came looking for a place where the fighting might matter more than it did back home. Does it matter more? I mean, ask me in a year. He almost smiled at that. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen cross his face since the poker table. Over the following days, he started teaching her things in return. Small, practical things she hadn't known she needed. How to sit a horse without gripping the reins like she meant to strangle them. How to hold a revolver so it wouldn't buck out of her hand the first time she fired it. He was a patient teacher in his own gruff way, correcting her stance with 2 words and a nod rather than a lecture. You're not going to survive out here on kindness. Alone, he told her one afternoon, watching her line up a shot at a fence post 50 feet off. Kindness gets you a long way with people worth it. But this land doesn't care how good your heart is. Clara fired and missed the post by a wide margin. Silas didn't laugh at her. Again, he said, elbow down. She fired again. Closer this time. By the end of the week, she could hit the post 4 times out of 6. And something had settled between them that neither one of them named out loud. Not friendship exactly. Not yet anything else. Just the quiet understanding of 2 people who'd started to trust each other's hands. Thaddeus Stone rode out to the ranch on a bright, cold morning 2 weeks later, flanked by 2 of his men and trailed by a boy who couldn't have been older than 17. Silas met him at the gate before he could get any closer to the house. This is private land, Thaddeus. Just a friendly visit. Thaddeus's horse pawed at the frozen ground, impatient. He looked past Silas toward the house, toward the barn, taking inventory the way he took inventory of everything, weighing it for what he could take from it. I hear you've got quite the collection out here. Freedmen, natives, a mute orphan, regular menagerie. Say what you came to say. I came to make an offer. Generous one, considering the state of this place. Thaddeus's eyes drifted, deliberate, toward the house where Clara had just stepped onto the porch with an armful of firewood. Water rights on this land are worth more than you know. I'd hate to see something happen to it before you had the sense to sell. Is that a threat? It's an observation, Vance. Winters are hard out here. Fires happen. Accidents happen. A man with so many people depending on him ought to think about their safety, not just his pride. Silas's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. Get off my land. Thaddeus smiled his easy smile. The one that had fooled 100 desperate people into signing their lives away. Think about my offer. He turned his horse, then paused, glancing back at the boy trailing behind him. Gideon, stay here a while. Make yourself useful. Learn the lay of the land. It wasn't a request, and everyone there knew it. Gideon Marsh was thin in a way that spoke of a hard winter, with a face too young for the tired look in his eyes. He stood awkward and out of place at the fence line after Thaddeus and his men rode off, clearly unsure what he was supposed to do with himself, now that he'd been left behind like a dog told to sit. "You can help Eli with the fence posts," Silas said finally. Not unkind, but not warm either. "Barn's that way." Gideon nodded and went, grateful for something to do that didn't involve standing under Silas's watchful eye. Clara found him 3 days later in the barn after dark, hunched in a corner near the lantern light, a book open on his knees. Her book, one she'd left on the porch railing that afternoon, a worn copy of stories she'd carried all the way from Boston. He startled so hard he nearly dropped it. "I wasn't stealing it," he said quickly. "I was just going to read a page and put it back before anybody noticed. You could have asked. Didn't figure you'd say yes." He said it flat, like a fact he'd learned the hard way. "Nobody says yes to me for much of anything." Clara sat down on a hay bale a few feet from him, unhurried. "What were you reading?" He looked down at the page like he'd been caught doing something shameful. "Story about a fox, the one who tricks the hunter. That's one of Maya's favorites." Didn't know a mute girl could have favorites. "She's not mute because she has nothing to say," Clara said. "She's mute because the world taught her it wasn't safe to say it. There's a difference." Gideon went quiet at that, turning the words over, like he recognized something in them he hadn't expected to. "Why do you work for him?" Clara asked. "Thaddeus, my mother's sick. Real sick. Doctor in town won't treat her without payment up front. And Thaddeus is the only one who'll loan money without asking 100 questions first." Gideon's hands tightened around the book. "I know what he is. I'm not blind to it. But I don't have another way to keep her alive." "That's not a choice," Clara said. "That's a trap, same as the one he built for me. He doesn't offer help. He offers rope and calls it a favor." Gideon didn't answer. He just stared at the lantern flame, like it might have something to tell him. Clara reached over and gently pushed the book the rest of the way into his hands. "Keep it," she said. "Finish it. Bring it back when you're done. Or don't. It's yours now." He looked at her like she'd handed him something far heavier than a book. "Why?" "I'm working for the man who's trying to run you and everybody here off this land. Because kindness isn't supposed to be a transaction," Clara said. "I'm not giving it to you because I expect something in return. I'm giving it to you because you're a person who deserves a story, same as anybody else. What you do with that is your business." Gideon didn't say anything else. He just held the book against his chest, like it might disappear if he loosened his grip. And Clara left him alone with it, the lantern light flickering low behind her as she walked back toward the house. She didn't know it then, but that small act, one worn book handed to a frightened boy with nothing to lose, would matter more than any gunfight or any ledger before this was over. Some debts get paid back in silver. Others get paid back in the only currency a person has left, which is the choice of who they decide to become when it finally counts. The storm came in without warning, the way the worst ones always did. Clara had been out at the far pasture with Eli, helping bring in a mare close to foaling, when the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the wind picked up so fast it stole the breath right out of her chest. By the time they got the mare into the barn, snow was coming down sideways, thick enough that the house had disappeared behind a wall of white, less than 50 yards away. "You're not walking to the house in that," Silas said, appearing out of the storm with his collar turned up and ice already forming in his eyebrows. "Nobody's walking anywhere in that. We waited out here." Eli didn't argue. He'd lived through enough Wyoming winters to know better than most. He settled the other hands into the loft with blankets and a lantern, and left Silas and Clara down below with the pregnant mare, who'd chosen the worst possible night to be nervous about her condition. The barn groaned under the wind. Somewhere above them, a loose board slapped against the frame, over and over, like something trying to get in. "She's close," Silas said, crouched near the mare's stall, his hand resting flat against her flank. "Might be tonight. Might be tomorrow. Either way, we don't leave her alone." Clara knelt beside him, cold seeping up through her skirt from the frozen ground. "What do we do if it happens now? In this, same as we do any other night. Just colder." He wasn't wrong about the cold. It found every gap in her coat. Every place her boots had gone thin at the sole. She pulled her arms tighter around herself and tried to remember the last time she'd felt warm all the way through. They built up the small stove in the corner as high as they dared, close enough to the hay that Silas kept glancing at it every few minutes like it might turn on them. The mare paced her stall, restless, blowing hard through her nose. Clara had never watched an animal give birth before. She hadn't expected to be doing it in the middle of a blizzard with a man she'd known for less than a month. "Talk to me," Silas said, not looking up from the mare. "Keeps my mind off the wind." "About what?" "Anything, Boston. Your father, whatever you want." So she talked. She told him about the brownstone she'd grown up in, the smell of her father's study, the sound of his typewriter going late into the night when he was drafting a speech he thought might finally move somebody in power to listen. She told him about the morning. Two men had come to the door with hats in their hands and grief on their faces, and how she'd known before they said a word what they'd come to tell her. Silas listened without interrupting, the way he did most things. Full attention and no rush to fill the silence when she paused. When she finished, he didn't offer her pity. He offered her something better. "He sounds like the kind of man this country needed more of," he said. "Doesn't surprise me. They were scared of him. Scared men do ugly things to brave ones. You sound like you know something about that. I know it firsthand." He shifted the log in the stove, sparks lifting and dying in the dark. "Fought 4 years in a war that was supposed to end all this. Half the men I served beside came home and forgot every lesson the war was supposed to teach them. Went right back to treating people like property the second the guns stopped. But not you. I saw too much to forget it. Seen a man bleed out in a ditch, defending the idea that another man wasn't fit to be free. Made it real hard to go back to pretending the color of somebody's skin means anything about the size of their heart." He looked at her then, steady, unflinching. "Your father understood that. Doesn't surprise me he scared people. Truth usually does." The wind picked a moment right then to slam against the barn wall, so hard the whole structure shuddered, and the mare screamed. Silas was up and moving before Clara had even registered the sound clearly. "Something's out there." The mare? "No." "Listen." Clara listened, and underneath the wind she heard it. A low, rising howl, then another answering it, then a third. Wolves, close, closer than close. "They can smell her," Silas said, already reaching for the rifle propped near the door. "Blood's coming, and they know it before we do. Get the lantern up high. Keep it burning, and don't you dare go near that door." Clara didn't listen to the second part. She grabbed the second rifle off its pegs, the one Silas had spent 3 weeks teaching her to hold without flinching, and checked it was loaded the way he'd shown her. Hands steadier than she expected them to be given the pounding in her chest. "I'm not hiding in a corner while you fight wolves alone," she said. Silas looked at her for one long second, snow blowing in through the gap under the door, the mare screaming again behind them. Whatever argument he'd been about to make, he swallowed it. "Stay behind the stall door. Don't step past it unless I tell you to. You see one get through. You aim center, and you don't hesitate." "I won't." The first wolf hit the loose board at the back of the barn like it had been waiting for an invitation. Silas fired before it cleared the gap, and the shot dropped it half in, half out of the barn. But 2 more came through the space behind it, lean and desperate with hunger, eyes catching the lantern light like coals. What followed wasn't graceful. It wasn't the kind of fight from the dime novels Clara had read as a girl. All clean shots and heroic poses. It was loud and messy and terrifying. The mare screaming, the other horses kicking their stalls in a panic. Silas shouting instructions over the chaos, while he worked the bolt of his rifle faster than she'd thought a man could move. A wolf broke past him, going straight for the mare's stall. And Clara didn't think. She raised the rifle, found the shape in the lantern light, and fired. It dropped 3 feet from the stall gate. Silas turned, chest heaving, and found her standing with the rifle still raised, hands shaking now that the moment had passed, eyes wide with the shock of what she'd just done. "You hit him," he said. "I hit him," she repeated, like she needed to hear it again to believe it. Two more wolves circled at the broken board, weighing the losses against the hunger. And finally the pack thinned back into the storm, driven off by gunfire and the smell of their own dead. Silas dragged a heavy crate against the gap and braced it there, checking twice that it would hold, before he finally let the rifle hang loose in his hand and turned back to Clara. She was still standing there, rifle lowered now, shaking hard, adrenaline draining out of her all at once and leaving something raw behind it. "Hey," he said, crossing the space between them. "You did good. You hear me? You did real good." "I've never shot anything before tonight," she said. "Not a person, not an animal, nothing. First time's always the hardest." He set his rifle aside and reached for her hands, steadying them between his own, warm, despite the cold that had settled into everything else in the barn. "You didn't hesitate. That's what matters. Hesitating gets people killed out here." The mare, as if she'd been waiting for the danger to pass, chose that exact moment to go down hard in her stall, and the next hour disappeared into new terror and new work, guiding the foal into the world with hands that had clearly done this before. Clara holding the lantern steady and murmuring low words to the exhausted mare, the two of them moving together without needing to discuss who did what. By the time the foal stood on wobbling legs for the first time, damp and blinking in the lantern light, the storm outside had begun to settle into something gentler, the wind dropping from a scream to a low, steady moan. Silas sat back against the stall wall, exhausted, blood and hay dust on his sleeves, and looked at Clara like he was seeing something in her he hadn't let himself notice before. "You could have stayed in the house tonight," he said. "Could have let Eli handle the mare. Could have stayed hidden when the wolves came through, instead of picking up a rifle." "I could have," Clara agreed, "but I didn't want to." "Why not?" "Because I'm tired of being the person things happen to," she said. "I want to be the person who does something about it." Something shifted in his face then. Some wall she hadn't realized was there finally cracking loose. He reached up and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. Slow, careful, like he expected her to pull away. She didn't. What happened between them after that wasn't rushed and wasn't careless. It was two people who had spent weeks proving to each other, in small, unglamorous ways, that they could be trusted with something fragile. It was his hand, finding hers in the lantern light, and her leaning into him instead of away, and neither one of them saying a word, because for once words weren't what the moment called for. It was warmth built slowly against a night that had tried its hardest to freeze them both, born out of adrenaline and relief, and a trust that had been earned one shared chore at a time. When morning finally broke pale and quiet over the ranch, the storm had passed. The foal was nursing steady, and something between them had changed for good. 2 weeks after the blizzard, Clara rode into town for chalk and paper, a list Maya had helped her write out in careful, wobbling letters the night before. She should have known better than to expect an easy trip. The commotion started outside the mercantile, a crowd gathering the way. Crowds always gathered when somebody else's misery was on display for free. Clara pushed through the edge of it and found two of Thaddeus's men dragging a black ranch hand named Josiah Freeman out of the feed store by his collar. A crumpled paper waved in one man's fist like a hunting trophy. "Says right here you owe the bank $40 in unpaid feed accounts." The man was shouting, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Sheriff's on his way. You're going to the county jail till it's paid." Josiah wasn't fighting them. Clara had seen enough of Deadwood Creek by now to understand why. A black man fighting back against two white men in the middle of the street, in front of a crowd of onlookers, who'd already decided which side of the story they believed. Wasn't a fight he could win by force. He stood still, jaw tight, humiliation written plain across his face, while a dozen respectable ladies in their Sunday best watched from the boardwalk and said nothing, did nothing. Some of them even nodding along like justice was finally being served. Clara felt the old fury rise up in her. The same fury she'd watched consume her father's letters late at night. The fury of watching a system built to protect only certain people work exactly as it was designed to work. She didn't reach for a weapon. She reached for the paper. "May I see that?" she asked, stepping forward with a steadiness she didn't entirely feel. The man holding it sneered. "This isn't your business, miss. It became my business the moment you started reading legal claims to a public street instead of a judge." Clara held out her hand, and something in her voice, calm and certain, made him hesitate long enough to hand it over. She scanned the numbers fast, the way her father had taught her to scan a bad contract, looking for the seams where the truth had been stretched thin. It didn't take her long to find them. "This account is dated for feed purchased in December," she said, loud enough for the crowd to hear now. Because a crowd that had watched a man be humiliated deserved to watch the humiliation undone too. Federal contract law requires 30 days written notice before a debt like this can be escalated to arrest. And there's no notice attached to this claim. Furthermore, your own ledger here lists the interest rate at 18%, which exceeds the legal usury limit set by territorial statute by a full 6 points. The man blinked at her like she'd started speaking another language. "That means this claim is unenforceable as written," Clara continued, her voice steady, cutting clean through the murmur that had started up in the crowd. "If you take Mr. Freeman to the county jail on the basis of this document, you're not enforcing a debt. You're committing a false arrest. And I will personally see that a federal judge hears about it." "You don't know what you're talking about," the second man said, though the confidence had gone out of his voice. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. My father was a legal advocate for men and women who'd been trapped by contracts just like this one. And I spent my childhood reading every case he ever fought. I know territorial statute better than most lawyers in this town. And I'm telling you, in front of every witness standing here, that this claim will not hold in front of a judge." The crowd had gone quiet in a different way now. The kind of quiet that came from watching something unexpected happen. Josiah stood a little straighter. One of the ladies on the boardwalk had stopped nodding. The man holding the paper looked around at the crowd, weighing his options, and found none of them good. Backing down in front of a whole street of witnesses cost him something. Following through on an illegal arrest with a witness who'd already announced she'd go to a federal judge cost him more. "We'll take this up with Mr. Stone," he said finally, snatching the paper back and letting go of Josiah's collar like it had suddenly burned him. "This isn't over. It is for today," Clara said. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring, some of them looking at Clara with something like respect, others with the wary discomfort of people who'd just watched their comfortable assumptions get challenged in public. Josiah straightened his coat and looked at Clara with an expression she'd remember for a long time. "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you for that." "Don't thank me," Clara said. "Just remember it. Next time somebody tells you the law only protects certain people, it protects whoever's smart enough and brave enough to demand it does." From across the street, in the shadow of the general store awning, Silas had watched the entire exchange without saying a word. He'd ridden into town to fetch nails and found himself instead watching Clara Montgomery dismantle 2 armed men with nothing but a piece of paper and an unshakable command of the law. He crossed the street once the crowd had thinned, and Clara turned to find him watching her, with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not quite surprise, something closer to awe. "You could have gotten hurt," he said. "Man like that doesn't take kindly to being shown up in front of a crowd." "Maybe. But somebody had to say something, and nobody else was going to. I've watched you shoot a wolf out of the dark and stare down 2 armed men without your voice shaking once," Silas said. "I'm starting to think there isn't much in this world that scares you." "Plenty scares me," Clara said. "I just decided a while back that letting fear make my decisions for me wasn't a life worth living. My father taught me that too. He used to say the law is only as strong as the people willing to stand in the street and demand it means something." Silas looked at her for a long moment, something warm and quiet passing behind his eyes. "He'd be proud of you." "I didn't know him," but I know that much. Clara felt her throat tighten, and she nodded instead of trying to speak. And together they walked back toward the horses while the last of the crowd dispersed behind them, already retelling the story to anyone who hadn't been there to see it themselves. The fire came 3 nights later, and it came exactly the way cowards always came, under cover of darkness, when nobody could be blamed to their face. Clara woke to the smell of smoke thick enough to choke on, and Silas already at the window, jaw set like stone, watching orange light flicker against the black horizon a half-mile off. "That's the schoolhouse," he said, and his voice had gone flat and cold in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "That's my schoolhouse." He'd built it himself over 3 weeks, timber cut and hauled from his own land. A small one-room building with real glass windows he'd ordered special from the county seat, meant to be Clara's classroom once the worst of winter broke. By the time they reached it on horseback, there was nothing left to save, just a skeleton of blackened timber collapsing slow into itself, smoke rising thick against the stars, the cold air doing nothing to ease the heat still radiating off the ruins. Silas dismounted and stood in front of it, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. Clara had never seen a silence sit so heavy on a person. "I know who did this," he said finally. "Don't need a signed confession to know. Silas, I built that for you." His voice cracked on the last word, the first crack she'd ever heard in it. "For you and for Maya, and for every kid on this ranch who deserved better than what this town was willing to give them." And he burned it to the ground, because he can't stand the thought of losing. He turned and started walking back toward the house with a speed that told her exactly what he intended to do next. And by the time she caught up with him, he already had his gun belt off the hook by the door, strapping it on with hands that shook with fury rather than fear. "What are you doing?" she asked, though she already knew. "I'm going to ride into town, and I'm going to finish what should have been finished the night I won your contract off him." He checked the cylinder of his revolver, methodical even in his rage. "He wants to burn things down. I'll show him what burning down really looks like." "Silas, stop." "I won't stop." He reached for his coat. "You didn't grow up out here, Clara. Men like Thaddeus only understand one language, and it isn't the language you used on him in the street. It's this one." Clara moved fast, faster than she'd moved for anything since the wolves in the barn, and put herself between him and the door. "Look at me," she said. "Look at me, Silas." He looked at her, chest heaving, eyes lit with something dangerous. "If you ride into that town tonight, and you kill him, what happens tomorrow? You think the law protects a man who shoots the mayor in cold blood, no matter how much he deserved it. You'll hang. Silas, they will find any excuse to hang you. And Maya will grow up without the only father she's ever had. And I will have watched the man I love throw his whole life away on a night when rage got to speak louder than reason." The word love hung between them, unplanned, and neither one of them acknowledged it out loud. But something in Silas's shoulders dropped half an inch at the sound of it. He burned it down. "Clara, he tried to take everything I've built. I know, and it is unforgivable, and he will pay for it. But not like this. Not with a bullet that makes you exactly the kind of man he already thinks you are." Clara reached up and pressed her palm flat against his chest, over the place where his heart was hammering hard enough she could feel it through his coat. "You told me once that true civilization isn't built at the barrel of a gun. You told me that the day you burned my contract instead of using it against me. Was that just talk?" Silas closed his eyes. "We have his ledgers," Clara continued. "Softer now, or we will, once we find a way to get them. Every illegal contract, every rigged interest rate, every falsified debt he's used to trap people, just like he tried to trap me. That's what actually hangs a man like Thaddeus Stone. Not a bullet in a dark street where nobody can prove who fired it. A courtroom, in daylight, where the whole territory can see exactly what he is. That could take months, years maybe. Then it takes years. But it ends with him in a cell, and this land in your name and Maya's safe, instead of ending with you, swinging from a rope for giving him exactly what he wants." Silas stood there a long time. the fury in him slowly losing its grip, replaced by something heavier and more exhausted. He looked past Clara at the door, then back at her face. And finally, he unbuckled the gun belt and let it fall onto the table with a heavy, final sound. "I hate that you're right," he said. "I know. I wanted to burn something down tonight, as badly as I've wanted anything in years. I know that too." Clara reached up and touched the side of his face, gentle where the fire outside had been anything but. "But you're not the kind of man who lets hate drive the wagon. That's exactly why this ranch is full of people other towns threw away. That's exactly why Maya trusts you. Don't let one bad night undo 2 years of proving them right to trust you." Silas exhaled, long and slow, some of the tension finally leaving his frame. He pulled Clara into him, resting his chin against the top of her head. And they stood like that in the dim kitchen, while the last of the schoolhouse's smoke drifted past the window outside. "We'll get his ledgers," he said finally. "We'll do this the right way. We will, but when this is over, Clara, and it will be over, I want you to know I meant what I almost said out loud back there." Clara looked up at him, and for the first time since the blizzard, she let herself smile fully, unguarded. "I heard you the first time," she said. "I meant it too." Outside, the wind carried the last of the smoke off toward the hills, and somewhere in the dark, in a warm bed with Mrs. Ruiz watching over her, Maya slept soundly through the whole thing, safe in a house full of people who had chosen, again and again, to answer cruelty with something stronger than rage. Silas left for the county seat before dawn, riding hard on his fastest horse, with a letter in his coat addressed to a man he hadn't spoken to in 11 years. Colonel Josiah Whitfield had commanded Silas's cavalry unit through the worst 2 years of the war, and had gone on afterward to a federal judgeship 2 counties over. Silas hadn't wanted to call in old favors. He'd built this ranch on the principle of standing on his own 2 feet. But Clara was right about one thing. A bullet in the dark would only prove Thaddeus's point. What they needed was federal authority. A marshal with the power to seize records and make arrests that would actually stick in a court of law. "I'll be back in 3 days," he told Clara at the gate, snow crunching under his horse's hooves. "4 at the worst, if the passes are bad. Eli's in charge while I'm gone. You keep Maya close, and you keep that rifle closer." "We'll be fine," Clara said, though something in her chest had gone tight with worry the moment he mentioned leaving. "Go. The sooner you get there, the sooner this ends." She watched him ride off until the cold forced her back inside, and told herself the unease sitting in her stomach was nothing more than the natural fear of being left in charge of a household during a conflict with a dangerous man. She was wrong about that, and she wouldn't understand how wrong until nightfall. Thaddeus Stone had eyes on the ranch that Silas didn't know about, not Gideon, who had quietly stopped reporting anything useful weeks earlier, offering vague nothing in his updates while keeping the real details to himself. This was a different man. A drifter Thaddeus had paid in whiskey and coin to watch the road from a distance, and he'd seen Silas ride out alone that morning and ride hard in the direction of the county seat. By afternoon, word had reached Thaddeus in his office above the bank. "He's gone for a judge," Thaddeus said, more to himself than to the men gathered in his office. "Fool thinks paperwork is going to save that land. What do you want done?" one of his men asked. Thaddeus considered the question for a long moment, turning a pen over in his fingers, weighing the risk against the opportunity. Vance was untouchable, while he stood on his own land, with a rifle in hand, and a house full of people willing to fight beside him. But Silas Vance was 2 days from home right now, and that changed the math considerably. The girl's soft on that Freeman family and half the town's charity cases, Thaddeus said. But it's the child that matters to him. Everybody knows a man like Vance would burn the whole territory down to protect that mute little orphan of his. "You mean to take her?" "I mean to end this before that judge ever gets a chance to sign anything." Thaddeus set the pen down, his decision made. "Bring her to the old mill house outside town. Nobody hurts her. I'm not a monster, whatever people say about me. I just need Vance to understand what he stands to lose if he doesn't sell that land. Quiet and legal, the moment he gets back. They struck at dusk, while Maya was gathering eggs near the coop, with Mrs. Ruiz watching from the porch. 3 men came up from the tree line fast, and Mrs. Ruiz raised the alarm the second she saw them. But by the time Eli and the others reached the yard with rifles in hand, the men had already grabbed Maya and were riding hard for the tree line with her. Clara heard the shouting from inside the house and was out the door before she'd even grabbed her coat, rifle in hand, running toward the commotion. With her heart hammering so hard she could barely hear anything over the sound of it. They took her, Mrs. Ruiz said, breathless, pale with fear. 3 men. They just grabbed her and rode off toward town. Clara stood in the yard with the cold biting through her thin dress, and for one terrible moment she felt the old fear rise up in her. The paralyzing fear that had gripped her the night Thaddeus first laid claim to her contract. She could wait for Silas, ride out and try to find him on the road, lose precious hours explaining what had happened. Hope he made it back in time to do something about it. She rejected that thought before it fully formed. Eli, she said, turning to find him already reloading his rifle. Get every hand on this ranch into the kitchen. Right now, within 20 minutes, the kitchen was full. Eli standing bare, 2 elk, Mrs. Ruiz, and 3 more hands who'd come running at the sound of trouble. Clara stood at the head of the table where she'd taught Maya her letters every morning for weeks, and looked at the faces gathered around her, all of them waiting for direction. Thaddeus wants Silas's land, she said. He's taken Maya to force the sale. He's not going to hurt her, not directly, because a dead child is a hanging offense even for a man with his money. But he will use her as leverage the moment Silas gets back. And every hour she's in his hands is an hour too many. What do you want us to do? Eli asked. I want to bring her home before Silas ever has to negotiate with that man for anything. 2 elk shook his head slowly. Thaddeus has a dozen armed men in that town. We've got, 6 of us here who can shoot straight. We're not going to fight our way through a dozen armed men, Clara said. We're going to make sure those men aren't standing where they're supposed to be standing. She laid out the plan as it had formed in her head over the last 20 minutes. Rough and imperfect, but built on something she understood better than gunplay. She understood people. She understood that Thaddeus's men, for all their bluster, were mostly hired muscle who cared more about their own pay than about dying for a mayor's grudge. And she understood the town itself, the layout of it, the lumber yard sitting close to the mill house, where they'd surely taken Maya, full of dry stacked timber that would burn fast and bright and impossible to ignore. We need a distraction big enough that every man Thaddeus has got pulls away from wherever Maya is being kept, Clara said. The lumber yard sits close enough to the mill that a fire there will draw every eye in town. While they're fighting that fire, a smaller group goes in quiet and gets Maya out. That's a lot of risk for a fire nobody asked us to set, Eli said, though there was something like admiration in his voice. I know it is, but I'm not asking you to risk it alone. Clara looked around the table. There are people in this town who owe Thaddeus nothing but grief. The saloon girls he's trapped in debt, just like he trapped me. The sweepers and stable hands who've spent years being spoken down to by men exactly like him. I've been teaching some of them to read on my trips into town, quiet when nobody was looking. I think if we ask them, some of them will help us. Not because they owe us anything, because they'd relish the chance to hurt a man who spent years hurting them. It took 2 hours to reach town under cover of dark, riding careful along back trails. Eli knew better than the main road. Clara found Sadie first, one of the saloon girls she'd befriended weeks earlier over stolen lessons in the alley behind the Golden Nugget, teaching her letters between customers, because Sadie had dreamed since childhood of writing her mother. A letter she'd never learned how to write. You want us to help you burn down the lumber yard, Sadie said, when Clara laid out the plan in a hushed corner of the alley. That's asking a lot. Clara, I know it is. I wouldn't ask if a child's life wasn't on the line. Sadie looked at her for a long moment, something calculating behind her tired eyes. Then she smiled, slow and sharp. Honestly, sugar. I've been waiting 2 years for an excuse. Word spread quiet and fast. Through the parts of town Thaddeus never bothered to notice. The kitchens and stables and back alleys where the people he exploited every day lived their invisible lives. By midnight, a dozen of them had gathered, armed with nothing more than lanterns, kerosene, and a shared hatred of the man who'd built his fortune on their backs. The fire started just after 1 in the morning, catching fast in the dry stacked lumber, flames leaping high enough to light the whole eastern edge of town in flickering orange. The alarm went up immediately, and just as Clara had predicted, Thaddeus's men came running from every direction, abandoning their posts to fight a blaze that threatened half the buildings on that side of the street, while the town scrambled and shouted and formed bucket lines against the fire. Clara, Eli, and 2 Elk moved quiet through the chaos toward the old mill house on the edge of town, where Sadie had confirmed Maya was being held. The mill house sat dark except for a single lit window on the second floor, and Clara's heart clenched at the sight of it, thinking of Maya alone and terrified in a strange room while the world outside burned. 2 men stood guard near the front door, distracted by the glow of the fire on the horizon, arguing about whether they should abandon their post to help fight it. Eli and 2 Elk handled them quickly and quietly, the element of surprise doing most of the work, and within minutes Clara was slipping through the mill house's side door, with her rifle held ready. She found Maya on the second floor, tied loosely to a chair in an otherwise empty room. Tear tracks dried on her small face, but otherwise unharmed. The moment she saw Clara, something broke loose in her that had been holding tight since the men took her, and she made a sound, small and strangled. The first sound Clara had ever heard her make. That wasn't a word, but wasn't silence either. "I'm here," Clara said, cutting the ropes fast, pulling the girl into her arms. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe now." That was when she found Thaddeus's private study on the ground floor, on their way back out. A lit lamp, still burning over a desk, covered in ledgers. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to find so soon. Clara froze in the doorway, weighing the risk against the opportunity, and made her decision in the space of a heartbeat. She set Maya gently on a chair in the hallway, told her to stay put and stay quiet, and moved into the study to gather every ledger she could carry. The books told the whole ugly story in Thaddeus's own careful handwriting. Falsified debts, interest rates that violated territorial law by wide margins, a running tally of families he'd trapped in the same scheme he'd used on Clara, going back years. Each name a person whose life had been quietly stolen and sold back to them at extortionate rates. She'd gathered nearly everything into a canvas sack when the door behind her opened, and Thaddeus Stone walked in. "Well," he said, closing the door behind him with a quiet, final click, "I did wonder how long it would take you to find your way here. Where are your men?" "Fighting a fire, you said." "I'd imagine. Clever, Miss Montgomery. Genuinely clever. I underestimated you, and I don't make that mistake twice." He crossed the room slowly, unhurried, and drew a revolver from beneath his coat. "Put the ledgers down." Clara's hands tightened around the sack. "They're evidence of exactly what you are. I'm not putting them down. Then I suppose we have a problem." Thaddeus raised the revolver, leveling it at her chest, his voice going cold and flat in a way she hadn't heard from him before. All the charm stripped away to show whatever ugly thing had always lived underneath it. "You know what I've come to understand about this territory, Miss Montgomery. The weak are meant to be crushed. That's not cruelty. That's simply the order of things. The same order that built empires and railroads and every fortune worth having. I offered you a place in that order once. You should have taken it. I'd rather die than take a place built on other people's suffering. That can be arranged." His finger tightened on the trigger, and Clara had one single, terrible second to understand she wasn't going to be fast enough to do anything about it. No rifle raised, no cover to duck behind, nothing but the truth of the moment closing in around her. The window behind Thaddeus shattered. The shot came from outside, fast and sudden, and for one confused instant Clara thought Thaddeus had fired. Then she saw him stagger, saw the second figure crashing through the broken window frame, and understood. Gideon Marsh had stepped between her and the bullet meant for her chest. He hit the floor hard, the book she'd given him weeks earlier still tucked inside his coat, and the blood spreading fast beneath him stained its cover dark before Clara had even fully processed what had happened. Thaddeus stood frozen, his revolver still smoking, staring down at the boy he'd used and discarded for years, the boy who'd finally chosen a side. Gideon, Thaddeus said, something almost like confusion in his voice. Why would you? Because she gave me a book, Gideon said, blood on his lips, voice barely above a whisper. Nobody ever gave me anything without wanting something back, except her. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands hard against the wound, trying to slow blood that wasn't going to be slowed by hands alone. Stay with me, Gideon, stay with me. You hear me? My mother, he said, each word costing him more than the last. Tell her I did something good. Just once. Tell her that. Tell her yourself, Clara said, though her voice had broken, though she already knew the truth of what was happening beneath her hands. You're going to tell her yourself. The door burst open behind them, and for one wild moment, Clara thought it was more of Thaddeus's men come to finish what he'd started. It was Silas, 3 days early, mud and desperation on his face, with Colonel Whitfield, and 2 federal marshals right behind him, drawn by the smoke and the fire and a tip from Sadie that had reached them on the road into town. Drop the weapon, Whitfield said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who'd spent years in courtrooms and battlefields alike. You're under arrest. Thaddeus Stone, on suspicion of fraud, extortion, and attempted murder. Thaddeus looked at the revolver in his hand, at the marshals filling the doorway, at the ledgers spilling out of the canvas sack on the floor, and understood, all at once, that every carefully built lie of his life had just collapsed in the space of a single night. He didn't fight. He simply let the revolver fall from his hand, and something in his face went hollow and defeated as the marshals moved in to bind his wrists. Silas was already on the floor beside Gideon, beside Clara, his hands joining hers against the wound that neither of them could stop. Gideon's breathing had gone shallow and slow, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling, toward something none of them could see. You did good, boy, Silas said, his voice rough. You hear me? You did something good. Gideon's lips moved, one last time, though no sound came with it, and then he was still. Clara sat back on her heels in the sudden silence, blood on her hands, the book still tucked half open beneath Gideon's still fingers, its pages stained dark. Silas pulled her into him, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, the weight of the night settling heavy over both of them. Outside, the fire at the lumber yard had finally been brought under control, and the marshals were leading Thaddeus Stone out into the cold night air in chains, past the gathered crowd of townspeople who watched him go with expressions that ranged from shock to a grim, quiet satisfaction. In the hallway, Maya sat exactly where Clara had left her, small and silent. But when Silas scooped her up into his arms, she buried her face against his shoulder and finally let herself cry, the sound muffled but real. The first tears she'd allowed herself in longer than anyone could say. Spring came late that year, but it came thorough, melting the last of the snow off the hills in great slow sheets and coaxing green up through ground that had been frozen for months. They buried Gideon Marsh on a sunlit rise at the edge of the ranch, overlooking the pasture where the foal born during the blizzard now ran in wide, clumsy circles, testing legs that had finally grown strong enough to carry him. Half the town turned out for the service, more people than anyone had expected, including families whose names had been listed in Thaddeus's ledgers as victims of his schemes. People who understood now exactly what the boy's final choice had cost him and what it had saved. Gideon's mother stood at the graveside with Clara's arm around her shoulders, and Clara told her, word for word, what her son had asked her to say, and the woman wept in a way that carried both grief and a fierce, aching pride. He always wanted to do something that mattered, she said, thought he never got the chance. Working for a man like that, he got the chance, Clara said. He just had to choose it. And he did. They marked his grave with a simple stone, and beneath his name, at Clara's insistence, they carved a single line. He chose the harder good. It seemed the truest thing anyone could say about a boy who'd spent most of his short life doing what he was told, until the one moment it mattered most, when he'd finally done what was right instead. Thaddeus's trial took most of the spring. The ledgers Clara had recovered providing evidence so thorough and so damning that even his own lawyers struggled to mount much of a defense. He was convicted on charges of fraud and extortion, severe enough to see him sentenced to the territorial penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. His bank seized by federal order and its assets distributed back to the families he'd spent years exploiting. Josiah Freeman received his land clear of debt. Sadie received enough back pay to finally write that letter to her mother, and to mail it besides. The ranch itself had changed by the time the last of the trial concluded. What had once been a modest sanctuary for society's outcasts had grown into something larger. A purpose Silas and Clara had built together out of the ashes of that first burned schoolhouse, with money recovered from Thaddeus's seized assets, and with the help of half the town now grateful rather than suspicious of the strange family living on the edge of it. They'd built a proper school, 2 stories high with real glass windows and a bell that rang out clear across the hills every morning. Clara stood as its headmistress now, teaching children whose parents would never have been welcome in any other classroom in the territory. Native children, freedmen's children, orphans nobody else wanted. All of them gathered under one roof to learn their letters and their numbers from a woman who understood, better than most, what it meant to be handed a chance nobody else was willing to give. On a warm evening in late spring, Clara stood on the porch of the main house, watching the last light fade gold over the hills, listening to Maya's voice carry clear across the yard as she read a story aloud to 3 younger children gathered at her feet. Maya's voice had come back slow over the winter, first in whispers, then in full sentences, and now she read with the easy confidence of a child who no longer feared the sound of her own words. Silas came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin against the top of her head the way he had that first terrible night after the fire. Though everything about the moment now felt different, easier, settled in a way that had taken a long, hard year to earn. "You brought the light back to my world," he murmured against her hair. Clara leaned back against his chest, covering his hand with her own where it rested over her heart. "And you taught me how to keep it burning through the storm." They stood together in the fading light, watching the children they'd built this whole strange and hard-won life to protect, and neither one of them needed to say anything else. They had built something out here that Thaddeus Stone, with all his money and all his cruelty, had never understood and never could have. Not a fortune, not a kingdom, just a place where the people the world had thrown away could finally stand up straight and call somewhere home. Somewhere in the house behind them, a bell rang out for supper, calling the whole strange patchwork family in from the fields and the schoolhouse and the long golden evening. And Clara and Silas turned together to answer it, not as a man who had rescued a woman, and not as a woman who owed a man her survival, but as 2 people who had chosen, over and over, to build something better than what the world had handed them. That, more than anything else, was the lesson the whole ranch had been built to teach. Not that kindness makes a person weak, not that the law always protects the innocent without a fight to make it so, but that ordinary people, standing together, choosing courage over fear and justice over vengeance, could take a broken piece of frontier and turn it into something worth calling home. So what does a story like this really leave us with, once the smoke clears and the snow finally melts? At its heart, this isn't just a romance between a scarred rancher and a schoolteacher who found herself trapped in a debt she never agreed to. It's a story about what it actually means to be free, and how easily that freedom can be stolen from people who have the least power to protect it. Clara came west believing a piece of paper and a signature meant safety. What she found instead was a system built by men like Thaddeus Stone, men who dress up exploitation in the language of contracts and legality, who convince an entire town that cruelty is simply the natural order of things. And that's not just a frontier problem. That's a pattern that repeats anywhere. Power goes unchecked, and desperation makes people easy to trap. But this story also insists that another way is possible. Silas didn't build his ranch by preaching about equality. He built it by mucking out stalls beside the people the rest of the world had thrown away, by sitting at the same table, by letting his actions speak louder than any speech ever could. That's the quiet lesson underneath everything else here. Respect isn't something you announce. It's something you earn. One shared meal, one blistered hand, one small act of trust at a time. And then there's Gideon, a boy with no good options, forced into a corner by circumstances he didn't choose, who found one small act of kindness, a single book handed to him with no strings attached, and let it change the entire trajectory of his life. His final choice reminds us that compassion is never wasted, even when it seems like it's falling on hard, unpromising ground. Sometimes the smallest kindness we offer someone is the seed of the very thing that saves us later. And Clara herself. She didn't win this story with a gun. She won it with knowledge, with patience, with the refusal to let fear make her decisions for her. When Silas wanted to ride into town and settle things with a bullet, it was Clara who reminded him that vengeance and justice are not the same thing, that the law, however imperfect, is worth fighting to uphold rather than abandoning the moment it becomes inconvenient. That's a harder path. It's also the only path that builds something lasting, instead of something that simply repeats the violence it claims to be answering. In the end, this story leaves us with a simple truth. The people who change the world rarely do it with the loudest voice or the fastest gun. They do it by showing up, again and again, for people the world has decided don't matter. If this story moved you, if it made you believe a little more in the quiet power of decency, let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because we've got plenty more waiting for you. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.